Part 3 of The Ferret's Nest. Written by Love Glows in the Dark. Read by Bad Writer. When Harry had come home one day with a tiny tattoo of the outline of a ferret on his left flank, Draco had nearly carved it out with a knife. He'd been with Harry for long enough at this point to know about his love for tattoos and his random decisions to get inked with things that were meaningful to him. Over the course of their relationship, Harry had gotten so many tattoos that eventually the little ferret hadn't been a big deal for Draco. He'd been at the tattoo parlour when he'd gotten the twin black paw prints in memory of his godfather. Harry jokingly referred to him as his dog father, and then had laughed at his own joke for a whole 20 minutes. A complete moon cycle in a gradient of grey in memory of Remus Lupin. Elegant and also strangely titillating. But Draco never told Harry that. The bright, fiery phoenix was a tribute to Albus Dumbledore, and to the bird itself, as Harry had insisted. A beautifully illustrated cat to pay homage to Minerva McGonagall, complete with the exact same markings around the eyes. A pink umbrella with minuscule sparks shooting out of the pointed end for Hagrid. Something Draco hadn't really understood at first, but had just accepted because it made Harry smile that crinkly-eyed smile for a long time. And the Deathly Hallows symbol, which Harry got inked right underneath the scar of the Horcrux he had left on his chest. On Weasley and Granger's second wedding anniversary, Harry had surprised them by revealing a tattoo on his hip of an otter and a Jack Russell, sitting cuddled together, their snouts gently bumping. Draco had felt a sense of detached loneliness that day, but he didn't know if it was because of the familiar latent jealousy of their friendship, rearing its ugly head, or because of the fact that he still couldn't cast a Patronus himself. Harry had also gotten a golden snitch tattooed beneath the nape of his neck after losing to Draco at a Seekers match. Draco had been gleeful and extremely smug, not to mention relieved, because they had made a bet the loser would get the tattoo the very same day, and Draco had been terrified at the notion of having ink punctured into his skin and left there permanently. Personally, the only marks he liked having on himself were the ones Harry left on him. Draco loved them all. He could spend hours running his fingers over each outline and silhouette, every patch of colour, every graceful curve and curl of ink. They looked beautiful on the background of Harry's tan skin, each one telling its own story. When they indulged in leisurely sessions of love-making, Draco always found himself pressing soft fingertips and even softer lips over each one, watching Harry's muscles jump and shift under his touches. His favourite one, however, was the one Harry had gotten without even telling him. It had been a lazy Sunday morning when Draco had first noticed it. Harry, topless and drowsy, his back to Draco, had been making breakfast and humming to himself. Draco had been sat on the table, reading the gossip section of the Prophet and sipping his tea, darting frequently admiring glances at the ridiculously perfect V of Harry's upper body disappearing into his joggers. When Harry had finally turned around and come over with 2 plates loaded with sausages and eggs, the sunlight had caught on something unfamiliar on Harry's chest. Draco frowned, leaning forward and grabbing Harry's arm, and pulling him around the table until he was standing next to Draco. "What?" Harry rasped in confusion. It had taken Draco entirely too long to recognize the freshly inked lines, each one connecting a series of dots placed right over Harry's heart. Mouth open, breathing loud, Draco reached up and ran his fingertips over the new tattoo, hardly able to believe his eyes. Upon looking at Harry, he saw he was pink-cheeked and chewing nervously on his lip, eyes anxious behind his glasses as he regarded Draco. This is," Draco breathed, looking between Harry's face and the tattoo. Harry shrugged. "When did you—" "Last week," Harry mumbled. "I can't believe I didn't notice sooner." Draco shook his head with a sharp flick. Harry mumbled. Draco breathed. "Why didn't you show me? I thought you'd—" Harry broke off, absently scratching his taut stomach. Face still red, I don't know, it's me, Draco said, slowly getting to his feet and pressing into him, his own face heating now. It's Draco. Yes, Draco the Constellation, Harry blurted, like he thought Draco was really stupid. Because I love you, he suddenly added, and Draco smiled helplessly through the scowl that had been about to line his face. And I love you, he repeated, placing his palm over the tattoo and nuzzling Harry's jaw. You didn't have to, though. Did it hurt? Harry laughed. Have you seen how many of these I have? And then kissing Draco's nose. No, it didn't hurt. Not at all. I really love it, Draco admitted, unable to stop himself from tracing his thumb over the tattoo. Yeah? Yes. It's officially my favourite. Harry had laughed, and they'd settled down to eat breakfast. Draco staring unblinkingly across the table at the man he still couldn't believe he'd been lucky enough to land, and thinking that now that Harry had actually gotten a tattoo for him, they were probably stuck together forever. 'Cause tattoos are forever, right? The following week, Draco worked late almost every day. He was used to leaving Mungo's by 5, latest 6 every day, and going home and attempting to cook dinner until Harry got home and salvaged it, or simply waiting for Harry to get back, meanwhile reading or watching TV. On Thursday evening, it was past 7:30 when he flew home, exhausted, irritable, and smelling strongly of the bone-repairing potion he'd been working on all day. When he got home, Harry was in the kitchen mashing potatoes for shepherd's pie, and the lamb and vegetables smelt so good that Draco nearly just settled himself at the table like an excited Labrador to await a plateful of dinner. He loved Harry's shepherd's pie. Harry liked to add a heap of grated cheddar to the potatoes, and it crusted beautifully. Draco would always end up eating about 3 helpings more than he was actually capable of eating. Mouth-watering, Draco ambled away inside, pulling off his strained robes on the way, his mood drastically improving at the thought of a hot shower, followed by an unholy amount of shepherd's pie. When he got to the bedroom, the first thing he saw was Moody, sitting up on his hind legs on the bed between their pillows, and chewing determinedly on the corner of Draco's pillowcase. Without even thinking about it, Draco picked up the delicate silver vase on the set of drawers near the door and hurled it at the ferret with a bellow of anger. Moody easily ducked away, the vase hitting the pillow and rolling off to drop to the floor with a dull clang. Moody hopped off the bed and darted into the ensuite, hopping up onto the counter to crouch at the sink and drink out of the tap. Immediately running in after him, Draco grabbed him with both his hands and lifted his arms to fling him out of the bathroom. But the ferret beat him to it, and simply wriggled out of his grasp and leapt down, scampering out of the bedroom and pausing only to grab the robes Draco had just taken off and left in a pool near the door. "Don't even think about it!" Draco roared, giving him a chase at once. Harry, evidently on his way to investigate the source of all the screaming and clanging, froze in his tracks in bewilderment when Draco burst out of the bedroom, emitting shrill war cries as he ran after Moody, who was, of course, headed right for the kitchen, Draco's robe sliding along behind him. Unfortunately, Moody was exceptionally swift to squeeze in between the fridge and drag the robes in after him, and by the time Draco skidded in, he disappeared. "Oh, I'm so done with you," howled Draco, drawing his wand and simply levitating the fridge out of the way. The huge mass of metal hovered precariously in the air, the electric cord strained, the plug nearly falling out of the socket. Moody looked extremely startled. He'd apparently been arranging and burrowing into Draco's robes, and when he was suddenly exposed, he went completely still, sitting up on his haunches to stare up at the floating fridge, and then at Draco, who stood there, panting and red-faced. To Draco's rising ire, he saw some more garments of his in the nest. Moody had somehow acquired some more of his socks, a pajama top, and an old t-shirt of Harry's that Draco sometimes slept in. "You little shit!" Draco yelled, stomping forward. "Don't hurt him!" Harry cried, hurrying back in. "Oh, I totally planned to," Draco snapped, pointing his wand at the levitated fridge in his left hand and bending down to rifle through the contents of the nest with his right, grabbing his clothes and throwing them over his shoulder while the ferret hopped on the spot and screeched, swiping at Draco's hands with a tiny paw. "Get off!" barked Draco, backing the little creature away and dragging the old t-shirt out from under a carefully collected pile of stolen chocolate biscuits, shaking off the crumbs. Something much larger than your average biscuit toppled out from the folds of the t-shirt. Draco paused, scowling, as he flung the t-shirt aside and made a grab for it. It was a small black velvet box, and Draco turned it over and over in his hands for a few seconds, frowning down at it. Quite suddenly, his stomach clenched, and his wand slipped out of his hand. There was a rushing sound in his ears. Behind him, Harry seemed to have turned into stone for how silent he had fallen. Draco spotted the hinge on the box and turned it over, his hands clumsy and fumbling as he pried it open. The line of diamonds sparkling daintily up at him, the platinum band so shiny it was almost blinding. Draco stopped breathing entirely, his body turning hot and cold in turns, making him feel dizzy and discombobulated. He could feel his eyes bulging out madly, and his mouth went very dry. Swallowing hard, the lump in his throat aching, Draco slowly turned around. For one moment he thought Harry had left, but when he looked down to see Harry on one knee, his face scarlet as he wrung his hands anxiously, chewing on both lips. They both stared at each other for a while, Draco with his mouth hanging open, and Harry looking more and more apprehensive until, suddenly, he just screamed, "Well, will you fucking marry me then?" "You're lying," Draco said weakly, suddenly shivering from head to foot, like he'd been out in a snowstorm without any clothes on. At this, Harry looked so outraged that Draco huddily babbled, "If you're serious, if you really want to, then yes, I will. But if you're playing a trick on me, to embarrass me and make me think that you're—" Draco broke off and stumbled back into a step because Harry got to his feet and took one bold step towards him. Draco dropped the ring box in startlement. Harry caught it without looking away from Draco's face. "Will you marry me?" Harry asked quietly, plucking the ring out and tossing the box aside. "Yes," whispered Draco hoarsely, and then, clearing his throat and nodding, Yes, I will." Neither of them said a word as Harry lifted his hand and slid the ring on his finger. The silence stretched on as they both simply continued to stare down at the ring, twinkling prettily. Then Draco launched himself forward, covering the 1-inch gap between them to fling his arms around Harry's neck and crash their mouths together, kissing him so hard that their teeth clacked. Harry didn't exactly display much grace in kissing him back either, dragging Draco even closer with both hands on his bum and tilting his head to further deepen the wet, clumsy kiss. Draco had no sense of time or place when they kissed. All he was aware of was Harry's arms around him, Harry's mouth under his, and the diamond ring on his finger. They swayed where they stood, caressing each other as they kissed, Draco's heart beating so furiously fast and hard that he worried for a second that maybe he was going to need medical attention. But he ran his hands down Harry's shoulders and arms and then pressed them into Harry's chest so he could feel his heart racing too. Finally, breathless and flushed, they pulled away, beaming at one another, laughing in disbelief and exultation until they were interrupted by a bout of indignant chattering. Draco turned to see Moody hopping on the spot while looking up at the fridge that had, thankfully, not crashed back to the ground as Draco had been busy getting engaged to the guy he'd been in love with since he was 14. "You really thought that hiding that ring box in that idiot's nest was a good idea?" Draco asked, picking up his wand and returning to raise an eyebrow at Harry, although he couldn't help the accompanying grin. Harry grinned back. Well, you go through it every day, so... He trailed off, shrugging. You weren't worried that that creature might find it and swallow the ring or something? No, I told him it was a secret, Harry said very earnestly. Rolling his eyes, Draco turned around and carefully brought the fridge back down, lifting it until it was in its usual spot. There you go, you fucking pain in the arse, he said, quite helplessly, finding himself sounding rather fond. Build your fucking nest and soil it for all I care. Then Moody's little head appeared from behind the fridge, and he wiggled his nose at Draco, looking very pensive. Before Draco could even think another insult to hurl at him, the ferret had scuttled over to where Draco stood. The next second, he leapt up and scrambled up Draco's side, ending up in his shoulder and sniffing enthusiastically behind his ear. Draco froze in horror and stared at a rather shocked Harry. What does he want? Draco whispered, holding very still. Harry shook his head, his eyes very wide, watching as Moody pawed at Draco's hair for a moment before curling his long, fluffy body around his neck, so that Draco stood there looking like he was wearing a fur-lined scarf. Oh my God, said Draco and Harry in unison. He likes you, Harry exclaimed delightedly. That's why he kept stealing your stuff. No, Draco groaned, but I hate him. Moody squeaked softly and pressed his pink, damp little snout to Draco's cheek. Harry's eyes shone with happiness as his gaze wandered down to Draco's hand again. Wouldn't be the first time you learned to love someone you hated.